You'll never amount to anything. The words hung in the classroom air like a death sentence, sharp and final. Mr. Thompson's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, each syllable carefully crafted to cut deep. He stood at the front of the room, arms crossed over his pressed shirt and tie, looking down at the trembling 12-year-old boy as if inspecting something distasteful on the bottom of his shoe. Ethan Miller felt every eye in the classroom boring into him. His worn sneakers, the ones his mother had scrubbed clean just that morning despite their fraying laces, seemed to glow like beacons of shame. His second-hand uniform, clean but faded from too many washes, suddenly felt like a costume advertising his poverty to the world. "Did you hear me, Mr. Miller?" Thompson's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Or is your comprehension as limited as your circumstances?" Scattered laughter rippled through the rows of desks. "Not the whole class. Never the whole class. But enough. Always enough to make the humiliation complete. But this was not where our story truly begins. To understand how we arrived at this moment of casual cruelty, we must step back 3 hours earlier, to a morning that had started with such hope. 3 hours earlier, the alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness of the Miller apartment at 4:47 a.m. Karen Miller's hand shot out from under the thin blanket, silencing it with the practiced precision of someone who had been waking at this hour for 12 years. She didn't need an alarm, not really. Her body had long ago learned the rhythm of survival. Wake before the sun, work until your bones ache, sleep just enough to do it all again tomorrow. But she kept the alarm set anyway, a small insurance policy against the exhaustion that sometimes threatened to pull her under like a riptide. The apartment was small, a living room that doubled as her bedroom, one tiny bedroom for Ethan, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to pass each other, and a bathroom where the shower head dripped constantly, no matter how many times the superintendent promised to fix it. The walls were thin enough that they could hear Mrs. Chen upstairs shuffling around her kitchen, beginning her own pre-dawn routine. Karen sat on the edge of her fold-out couch, allowing herself 30 seconds, no more, to simply exist in the darkness. 30 seconds to feel the weight of her 34 years, to acknowledge the chronic ache in her lower back and the way her knees protested every morning. 30 seconds to think about the woman she might have been in a different life, with different choices, different luck. Then she stood, because that's what you did. You stood and you moved forward because there was a child sleeping in the next room who deserved better than a mother who surrendered to exhaustion. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a $15 machine from a thrift store that had lasted miraculously for 3 years, filling the small apartment with an aroma that smelled like alertness, like possibility. While it brewed, Karen moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of a practiced choreography. She pulled on her cleaning uniform, blue scrubs that she'd bought in bulk from a discount store, professional enough for the houses she cleaned but cheap enough to replace when bleach stains made them unwearable. Her hair went back in a tight bun, no jewelry except for the thin gold wedding band she still wore, though Michael had been gone for 8 years now. Some habits were harder to break than others. Some memories you wore on your finger because taking them off felt like admitting defeat. By 5:15, she was standing in Ethan's doorway, watching him sleep in the dim light that crept through the window from the street lamp outside. He slept the way children sleep when they feel safe, sprawled across his narrow bed with one arm flung over the side, his face peaceful and untroubled. The science textbook he'd been reading before bed had slipped from his fingers and lay open on the floor, a geography of knowledge that fascinated him. Karen felt her heart constrict with a love so fierce it was almost painful. This boy, this beautiful, brilliant boy, who read encyclopedias for fun and asked questions about the universe that she couldn't answer. This child who had never once complained about their circumstances, who wore his patched jeans with dignity and shared his lunch with classmates who had forgotten theirs. She thought about waking him, about stealing a few more minutes with her son before she had to leave for her first cleaning job at the Hendersons' mansion across town. But he needed his sleep. Growing brains needed rest, and his brain was growing toward something extraordinary. She could feel it. Instead, she moved quietly to his small desk and pulled out a piece of paper from the drawer. Karen had never finished high school herself. Pregnancy and poverty had ended those dreams. but she'd learned to write her love in notes that Ethan would find in his lunch bag and his backpack, taped to the bathroom mirror. Her handwriting was careful, each letter formed with concentration. My dearest Ethan, remember that you are smarter than you know, braver than you feel, and loved more than you can possibly imagine. Today and every day, you make me proud just by being exactly who you are. There's $3 in your jacket pocket for lunch. Get the hot meal today, baby. You need the protein. I'll see you tonight. Work hard, dream big, and never let anyone make you feel small. All my love, forever and always, Mom. She tucked the note into his backpack alongside the carefully packed lunch she'd prepared the night before. A sandwich made with the good bread she'd splurged on, an apple she'd polished until it gleamed, and a small bag of pretzels. It wasn't much, but it was made with love, and love, she'd learned, could sustain you through almost anything. At 5:30 a.m. exactly, Karen Miller locked the apartment door behind her and began the 40-minute bus ride to the wealthy neighborhood where she cleaned houses for people who would never know her name. 7:15 a.m. Ethan's own alarm went off at 7:15, giving him just enough time to get ready for school. He'd set it himself, had been setting it himself since he was 8 years old. Independence, his mother had taught him, wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about knowing what you could handle and asking for help with the rest. He moved through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency he'd learned from watching his mother. Shower, quick because hot water cost money. Breakfast, cereal with milk measured carefully so the carton would last the week. Uniform, the one his mother had laid out the night before, pressed with the iron that sometimes sparked but mostly worked. In the bathroom mirror, Ethan examined himself with the critical eye of a 12-year-old who was starting to understand how the world judged you before you opened your mouth. His brown hair stuck up in the back, no matter how much he wetted it down. His face still had that round, childish quality that made him look younger than his years. His brown eyes were too large, too earnest, the kind of eyes that teachers said showed potential, and bullies said looked weird. He was small for his age, which didn't help. While other boys in 7th grade were shooting up, developing the angular features of approaching adolescence, Ethan remained compact, unfinished. His body hadn't received the memo that it was supposed to be transforming into something more formidable. But it was the uniform that really set him apart. Every other kid at Riverside Preparatory Academy wore uniforms purchased from the school's official supplier. Crisp, new, perfectly fitted. Ethan's uniform came from the thrift store, purchased 2 sizes too large so he could grow into it, already worn thin by some previous student whose name was probably still written inside the collar in faded marker. At Riverside Prep, those differences mattered. Money was supposed to be the great equalizer in a school where everyone wore the same outfit. But money, Ethan had learned, always found a way to distinguish itself. It was in the quality of the fabric, the newness of the shoes, the brand of the backpack, the latest phone tucked in a pocket. Ethan had none of these markers of belonging. What he had instead was a mind that devoured knowledge with hungry intensity, a work ethic that made him complete every assignment with meticulous care, and a mother who believed in him with the kind of absolute faith that could move mountains, even if it couldn't buy new sneakers. He found his mother's note in his backpack, as he always did, and read it 3 times before tucking it carefully into the front pocket of his notebook. These notes were his secret treasures, his evidence that someone in this world thought he mattered. On particularly hard days, he would reread them during lunch, drawing strength from his mother's words like a knight drawing power from a talisman. The walk to school took 25 minutes. He could have taken the bus, but that cost $1.50 each way, and Ethan had done the math. $15 per week, $60 per month, $540 per school year. That was money better spent on food, on electricity, on the 1,000 other things his mother juggled in her careful budget. So he walked, and he used the time to think. This morning, he was working through a concept from his science textbook about cellular mitosis. The way cells divided and multiplied fascinated him, the elegant complexity of it, the way something so small contained entire instructions for life itself. He imagined he could see it happening as he walked, his own cells dividing and growing, pushing him toward the future person he would become. The neighborhood changed gradually as he walked. The apartment buildings gave way to small houses, then larger houses, then the expansive homes with manicured lawns and three-car garages. By the time he reached the iron gates of Riverside Preparatory Academy, he had traveled through several tax brackets, crossing an invisible border between different Americas. Riverside Prep stood like a monument to privilege, its brick buildings and carefully landscaped grounds radiating an aura of institutional permanence. The school had been founded in 1887 by industrialist Cornelius Riverside, who believed that education should be available to worthy young men of good character, a phrase that in practice meant wealthy white boys. Over the decades, the school had evolved, opening its doors to girls in 1972 and implementing a modest scholarship program in 1995 that allowed a handful of students like Ethan through its gates each year. These scholarship students were supposed to be proof of the school's commitment to diversity and opportunity. In reality, they were often a reminder to everyone else of how much they had and how little others possessed. Ethan joined the stream of students flowing through the main entrance. Around him, clusters of friends chatted about weekend plans, about new video games and upcoming birthday parties at entertainment venues that cost more for 2 hours than his mother earned in a week. He recognized most of them, hard not to in a school of only 400 students, but few of them would meet his eyes, let alone speak to him. There were exceptions. Maya Chen, whose mother lived in the apartment above theirs, always said hello. She was one of only 2 other scholarship students in his grade, and she understood the peculiar loneliness of being simultaneously inside and outside this world. They'd formed a quiet alliance, not exactly friends, but fellow travelers in a strange land. "Hey, Ethan," Maya said, falling into step beside him as they navigated the hallway toward their homeroom. "Did you finish the Thompson essay?" Ethan nodded. Mr. Thompson taught 7th grade English, and he'd assigned a 3-page essay on the role of individual responsibility in creating success. Ethan had spent 5 hours on it over the weekend, crafting careful arguments about how external circumstances shaped but didn't determine outcomes, about how resilience could overcome adversity, about how education was the great equalizer. He'd believed every word he wrote, or he had, until first period English class. 8:30 a.m., first period English. Mr. Raymond Thompson had been teaching at Riverside Prep for 17 years, a tenure that had granted him both permanent status and a classroom with windows overlooking the school's pristine athletic fields. He was 53 years old, possessed of a master's degree in English literature from a respectable state university, and harbored a carefully curated image of himself as a demanding but fair educator who challenged his students to reach their potential. The truth was more complex, as truth usually is. Thompson had entered teaching with genuine idealism, believing he could shape young minds and inspire a love of literature. But 17 years at an elite preparatory school had gradually transformed his idealism into cynicism. He'd watched generation after generation of privileged children slide through his classes on parental donations and minimal effort, their futures assured regardless of whether they learned anything at all. Most of them were pleasant enough, polite, if disengaged. They turned in adequate work, participated just enough to maintain decent grades, and moved on to prestigious universities where the cycle would repeat itself. They didn't challenge him intellectually, didn't share his passion for the transformative power of great literature, didn't seem to understand or care about the opportunities being handed to them on silver platters. And then there were the scholarship students, a different species entirely, hungrier, more intense, more desperate to prove themselves worthy of the opportunity they'd been granted. Thompson had taught dozens of them over the years, and he'd developed a particular theory about them. The scholarship students, in his observation, fell into 2 categories. The first category consisted of genuinely exceptional children, brilliant minds from unfortunate circumstances who leveraged their rare opportunity to catapult themselves into success. These students were inspiring, proof that the meritocracy could work if you just worked hard enough. The second category, and Thompson believed this was the majority, consisted of students who simply didn't have what it took. They were bright enough to earn the scholarship, but they lacked the indefinable quality that separated true success from mere adequacy. They struggled socially, unable to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the wealthy. They overcompensated academically, working themselves into exhaustion over assignments that their peers completed with casual ease. They were, in Thompson's private assessment, Charity cases who would eventually settle into lives of mediocrity despite everyone's best efforts. Ethan Miller, Thompson had decided, belonged to this second category. The boy was certainly intelligent. His test scores proved that. But he was small, painfully shy, and possessed of that desperate earnestness that Thompson found both pitiable and irritating. Ethan reminded Thompson of a puppy constantly seeking approval, eager to please but fundamentally out of place. What particularly grated on Thompson was the boy's refusal to accept his limitations. Ethan didn't just complete assignments. He attacked them with an intensity that Thompson found almost offensive. The essays were too long, the arguments too carefully constructed, the citations too numerous. It was as if the boy was trying to prove something with every assignment, trying to justify his existence at Riverside Prep through sheer volume of effort. Thompson found this striving distasteful. Success in his experience should look effortless. The best students at Riverside Prep wielded their intelligence like a casual accessory, not like a weapon they desperately needed for survival. So when Thompson had graded Ethan's essay on individual responsibility and success, he'd read it with a critical eye specifically tuned to find fault. Yes, the writing was technically proficient. Yes, the arguments were well constructed. But there was something about the essay's fundamental premise, this naive belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle, that irritated him. Students like Ethan needed to learn reality, Thompson believed. The world wasn't a meritocracy where intelligence and effort guaranteed success. The world was about connections, about social capital, about understanding your place and working within it. Ethan's insistence on dreaming beyond his circumstances wasn't inspirational, it was delusional. And sometimes, Thompson had convinced himself, the kindest thing a teacher could do was crush those delusions early, before they led to even greater disappointment. As students filed into his first period English class, Thompson arranged the graded essays on his desk in a specific order. He would return them one by one, using each as a teaching moment. Most would receive brief, perfunctory comments. But Ethan's essay, that would require special attention. The boy sat in the third row, fourth seat from the window, always the same seat, always arrived 5 minutes early, always had his materials organized with that maddening precision. Thompson noticed how Ethan's eyes kept darting to the stack of papers on the desk, how his hands fidgeted with his pen in nervous anticipation. Good, Thompson thought. Let him sweat a little. It's character building. Class, Thompson began once the bell rang, his voice carrying the authoritative timbre he'd perfected over nearly 2 decades of teaching. I have your essays on individual responsibility and success. Overall, I was underwhelmed. Many of you seem to believe that citing a few famous quotes and regurgitating platitudes about working hard and following your dreams constitutes deep thinking. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the classroom with practiced disappointment. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Success in writing, like success in life, requires more than effort. It requires insight. It requires understanding your audience and your purpose. It requires, above all, a clear-eyed assessment of reality rather than wishful thinking. Thompson began distributing the essays, moving methodically up and down the rows. Marcus, solid work. I appreciated your nuanced discussion of systemic factors. Jennifer, your opening paragraph was strong, but your conclusion needed more development. Daniel, I've noted several areas where your argument became repetitive. With each returned essay, Thompson provided brief, pointed feedback. Some students looked pleased, others disappointed, but none received the level of attention he was reserving for Ethan Miller. Finally, only one essay remained on his desk. The entire class could see it, and more importantly, they could see that Ethan was the only student who hadn't received his paper back. Thompson picked up the essay, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something slightly unclean. He walked slowly down the aisle toward Ethan's desk, his footsteps deliberate and echoing in the suddenly silent classroom. Mr. Miller, Thompson said, his voice carrying a particular sharpness that made several students sit up straighter in their seats. Your essay presents an interesting case study in the disconnect between effort and achievement. Ethan's face flushed red. His hands, which had been fidgeting with his pen, suddenly froze. Thompson could see the boy's throat working as he swallowed hard, could see the way his eyes dropped to his desk, refusing to meet Thompson's gaze. You've written 5 pages. Thompson emphasized the number with audible disdain. when the assignment clearly specified 3. This isn't ambition, Mr. Miller. This is an inability to follow basic instructions. I'm sorry, sir, Ethan said softly, his voice barely audible. I just wanted to fully develop my arguments. What you wanted, Thompson interrupted, his voice cutting through Ethan's explanation like a knife, is irrelevant. In the real world, Mr. Miller, employers and colleagues don't reward people who can't follow simple directions, no matter how well-intentioned their violations might be. He dropped the essay on Ethan's desk with a sharp slap that made the boy flinch. The paper was covered in red ink, Thompson's comments crowding the margins like accusations. Furthermore, Thompson continued, warming to his subject now, your central thesis, that individual determination can overcome socioeconomic limitations, is painfully naive. You cite examples of exceptional individuals who beat the odds, but you conveniently ignore the statistical reality that these are outliers, not representative samples. Around the classroom, students watched with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. This was more than Thompson's usual sharp criticism. This was something personal, something targeted. Success, Mr. Miller, isn't just about working hard. It's about realistic assessment of one's circumstances and opportunities. It's about understanding that some barriers exist for reasons, and that battering yourself against them out of misplaced optimism serves no purpose except to exhaust yourself. Thompson paused, letting his words sink in. He could see tears beginning to form in Ethan's eyes, could see the boy's jaw clenching as he fought to maintain composure. This is for his own good, Thompson told himself. Better to learn these lessons now, in a classroom, than to learn them after wasting years pursuing impossible dreams. Your grade is a C-, Thompson said, and that's generous, given your failure to follow the page requirement. I suggest that in future assignments you focus less on trying to impress me with volume and more on developing realistic perspectives on life. He turned to walk back to the front of the classroom, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way Ethan's hand trembled as he picked up the essay, or the way the other students were looking at the boy with a mixture of pity and relief that they weren't the target of Thompson's ire. Whatever the reason, Thompson turned back, and in that moment, he made a choice that would echo through both their lives in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Mr. Miller, he said, his voice carrying across the silent classroom with perfect, cruel clarity. I'm going to be honest with you, because I believe in preparing my students for reality, not coddling them with false hope. Ethan looked up, his eyes wide and vulnerable, still believing, despite everything, that his teacher might offer some encouragement, some recognition of his effort. You try very hard, Thompson continued. I can see that. You're clearly intelligent enough to complete the basic academic work. But trying hard isn't enough, and intelligence without context is useless. You come from a background that hasn't prepared you for what it takes to truly succeed at this level. Your mother works as a cleaner, doesn't she? The classroom went completely still. This had crossed a line, and everyone knew it, including Thompson, who felt a small voice in the back of his mind suggesting he should stop, should step back from this precipice. But he didn't stop. Pride, or perhaps something darker, the accumulated resentment of 17 years watching mediocre students succeed through privilege, drove him forward. There's nothing wrong with honest work, Thompson said, his tone suggesting he believed exactly the opposite. Someone has to do those jobs, but you need to understand something about your place in the world. You can work as hard as you want, write as many extra pages as you want, but at the end of the day, you're fighting against fundamental realities of class and opportunity that no amount of determination can overcome. Tears were rolling down Ethan's cheeks now, though he made no sound. His hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I've been teaching for 17 years, Thompson said, his voice taking on an almost professorial tone, as if he were delivering a lecture on an abstract concept rather than destroying a child's confidence. And in that time, I've seen dozens of scholarship students come through these halls. Some of them, the truly exceptional ones, managed to transcend their circumstances, but most, they eventually settle back into the same kind of lives their parents led. It's not cruelty to point this out, Mr. Miller. It's simply statistical reality. He moved back to his desk, his point made, his authority reasserted. But something in him, perhaps the last vestige of the idealistic young teacher he'd once been, compelled him to deliver one final blow disguised as advice. You'll never amount to anything. The words hung in the classroom air like a death sentence, sharp and final. That's not an insult, Thompson continued, his voice almost gentle now, which somehow made it worse. It's just honesty, and the sooner you accept it, the sooner you can adjust your expectations and find contentment in a life that's appropriate to your circumstances. There's dignity in knowing your limitations, Mr. Miller. I suggest you start learning that lesson now. The silence that followed Mr. Thompson's pronouncement was absolute. 23 students sat frozen in their seats, witnesses to a public execution carried out with words instead of weapons. Some looked away, embarrassed for Ethan. Others stared with the horrified fascination people reserve for car accidents and other disasters. A few, and this perhaps hurt most of all, nodded slightly, as if Thompson had merely articulated what everyone already knew to be true. Ethan Miller sat perfectly still, tears streaming down his face in silent rivers. His essay lay before him, covered in red ink that now looked less like corrections and more like bloodstains. The words "C" circled at the top seemed to pulse with accusatory brightness. You'll never amount to anything. The words replayed in his mind, each repetition driving them deeper, carving themselves into his consciousness like acid etching glass. This wasn't the casual cruelty of bullies in the hallway, children being thoughtlessly mean because they hadn't yet learned empathy. This was an adult, an authority figure, a teacher whose entire purpose was supposedly to nurture and develop young minds, delivering a carefully calculated judgment about his fundamental worth as a human being. Thompson had returned to his desk and was now discussing the next reading assignment, his voice carrying on as if nothing of consequence had occurred. As if he hadn't just told a 12-year-old child that his dreams were delusions, his efforts were futile, and his very existence was a mistake of circumstance that he should learn to accept. We'll be starting Great Expectations next week, Thompson was saying. I trust you all see the irony in that title, given our recent discussion about the dangers of unrealistic ambition. The bell rang at 9:20, releasing the students from first period. Ethan remained frozen in his seat while his classmates filed past. He could feel their glances, some pitying, some relieved, some simply curious about what he would do next. Maya Chen paused at his desk, her hand hovering near his shoulder as if she wanted to touch him, to offer comfort, but wasn't sure if contact would make things better or worse. Ethan, she whispered, don't listen to him. He's wrong. But her words, well-intentioned as they were, couldn't penetrate the wall of shame that had erected itself around him. Ethan nodded mechanically, not really hearing her, not really seeing anything except the red-inked essay and Thompson's words written across his future in permanent marker. When the classroom finally emptied, Ethan gathered his materials with mechanical precision. His hands moved automatically, closing his notebook, zipping his backpack, standing up, while his mind remained trapped in the moment of Thompson's verdict. He walked through the hallways in a daze, barely aware of the students flowing around him like water around a stone. He found himself in the bathroom on the second floor, the one that was rarely used because it was near the administrative offices and felt too exposed for the usual bathroom social dynamics. Ethan locked himself in the farthest stall and finally allowed himself to break. The sobs came from somewhere deep in his chest, wrenching and painful. He pressed his hand against his mouth to muffle the sound, terrified that someone might hear and witness this final degradation. His whole body shook with the force of it, not just the crying, but the accumulated weight of every snide comment, every condescending look, every moment of being made to feel less than crashing down on him at once. He thought about his mother, probably on her hands and knees at that very moment scrubbing someone else's floors. He thought about how she woke up before dawn and came home after dark, how her hands were always rough and red from chemicals, how she smiled through the exhaustion because she wanted him to believe that everything would be okay. What would she think if she knew? The question pierced him like a knife. What would she think if she knew that all her sacrifice, all her work, all her belief in me was for nothing, that her son is just a charity case who will never amount to anything? The thought of his mother's disappointment was somehow worse than Thompson's cruelty. Karen Miller had bet everything on the idea that education could change their lives, that intelligence and hard work could overcome the circumstances of Ethan's birth. She'd worked herself to exhaustion to keep him at Riverside Prep, to give him opportunities she'd never had, and Thompson had just declared that it was all for nothing. Ethan didn't know how long he stayed in that bathroom stall. Long enough that he missed his second period class. Long enough that the initial storm of crying subsided into quiet, hiccuping breaths. Long enough that his face, when he finally emerged to look in the mirror, was puffy and red and unmistakably marked by tears. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to reduce the evidence of his breakdown. The ancient paper towel dispenser grudgingly offered up a few rough brown sheets that felt like sandpaper against his skin. His reflection looked back at him from the mirror, eyes red-rimmed, face blotchy, the very picture of someone who had been crying in a bathroom stall like a child. Maybe Thompson was right, a small, poisonous voice whispered in his mind. Maybe I'm just fooling myself. Maybe I should stop trying so hard and just accept what I am. But even as the thought formed, something else stirred in Ethan's chest. Something that hadn't been there before Thompson's words. Something that had been born in the crucible of that humiliation. It was anger. Not the hot, explosive anger that makes you shout or throw things. This was something colder, denser, more controlled. It was the anger of every person who had ever been told they were nothing and decided to prove the world wrong. It was the anger that could be shaped into something harder than steel, sharper than any blade. You don't know me, Ethan thought, his reflection staring back at him with eyes that no longer looked quite so childish. You don't know what I can do. You don't know what I will do. He thought about his mother's notes, the ones he carried in his backpack like talismans. He thought about her hands, rough from work but gentle when she smoothed his hair back from his forehead. He thought about the way she believed in him with absolute, unconditional faith. Thompson had made a critical error in his assessment of Ethan Miller. He'd assumed that humiliation would break the boy, would teach him to accept his limitations and settle for less. What Thompson hadn't understood, couldn't understand perhaps, because he'd never been hungry for anything except respect from children forced to sit in his classroom, was that some people don't break under pressure. Some people crystallize. Ethan dried his face, straightened his uniform, and made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't erase Thompson's words or the memory of sitting in that classroom while his teacher systematically dismantled his sense of worth. But he could prove him wrong. Not with words. Thompson clearly didn't value Ethan's words no matter how carefully crafted. Not by trying to explain or justify himself. Justification was just another form of begging for approval he would never receive. No, Ethan would prove Thompson wrong by becoming someone that even Raymond Thompson couldn't dismiss. Someone whose success was so undeniable, so absolute, that it would stand as a living refutation of every cruel thing Thompson had ever said. The bell rang for third period. Ethan Miller straightened his shoulders, picked up his backpack, and walked out of that bathroom a different person than the one who had entered it. The child who had cried in the stall was still there, would always be there, in some sense, but he had been joined by something else now. Someone else. Someone who would never amount to anything. They would see. The whole world would see. That evening, 6:47 p.m. Karen Miller's key turned in the apartment lock at 6:47 p.m., exactly 13 hours after she'd left that morning. Her entire body ached with the specific exhaustion that comes from physical labor, the kind of tiredness that settles into your bones and makes even simple movements feel like swimming through honey. She'd cleaned 4 houses that day. The Hendersons' 6-bedroom mansion with its marble floors and endless windows. The Patterson family's modern monstrosity of glass and steel, where everything showed every fingerprint and smudge. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's historic brownstone with its antique furniture that required special cleaning solutions. And finally, the Riverside family estate. Yes, that Riverside. The family that had founded the school where her son studied on scholarship. The irony wasn't lost on her. She scrubbed the toilets of the people whose ancestors had built the institution her son attended. She polished the silverware of families who would never know her name, who saw her only as a function rather than a person. Their children sat in classrooms with Ethan, probably never knowing that the woman who cleaned their bathrooms was fighting like hell to give her son a different future. Karen dropped her bag by the door and immediately looked for signs of Ethan. His backpack was on the couch, his shoes lined up neatly by the door. She could hear water running. He was in the shower. Good. She needed a moment to herself anyway, a moment to transition from Karen the cleaner to Karen the mother. She pulled off her shoes, feeling the immediate relief as her feet were freed from the practical but unforgiving work sneakers. Her lower back protested as she straightened, a reminder that 34 wasn't as young as it used to be, especially when you spent 13 hours a day bending, reaching, scrubbing, and carrying. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Small, shabby, but clean. Karen had learned long ago that you could be poor, but you didn't have to look poor. Not in your home, anyway. The furniture was secondhand, the appliances were old, but everything was spotless, organized, maintained with the same meticulous care she brought to the mansions she cleaned. She moved to the kitchen and began preparing dinner, falling into the familiar rhythm of cooking. Tonight it would be spaghetti with meat sauce. Cheap, filling, and one of Ethan's favorites. She'd learned to make a dollar stretch further than most people thought possible. Shopping sales and cooking in bulk, freezing portions for later in the week. As she cooked, Karen's mind wandered to the question that occupied most of her waking thoughts. Was she doing enough? Was Riverside Prep the right choice? Would it have been better to send Ethan to their neighborhood school, where he wouldn't have to navigate the complex social dynamics of wealth inequality every single day? But no, she rejected that doubt as soon as it formed. The neighborhood school was overcrowded, underfunded, and struggling. Teachers there were overwhelmed and under-resourced. Students who showed promise were often held back by a system that simply didn't have the capacity to nurture them. Riverside Prep, for all its problems, offered opportunities that Karen could never provide on her own. Small class sizes, excellent teachers, access to advanced courses and college counseling, a pathway to universities that could transform Ethan's entire life trajectory. The social challenges he faced there, the sense of being an outsider, the awareness of class differences, those were temporary hurdles. Karen believed with absolute conviction that Ethan's intelligence and character would eventually win out, that his classmates would come to see him for who he truly was rather than what he lacked. She had to believe that. The alternative, that she was subjecting her son to unnecessary suffering for a dream that might never materialize, was too painful to contemplate. The shower shut off. Karen focused on stirring the sauce, giving Ethan privacy to emerge from the bathroom and settle himself before dinner. She heard his bedroom door close, heard the soft sound of his music playing. Something classical probably, or one of the educational podcasts he liked to listen to. "Ethan, baby," she called out. "Dinner in 10 minutes. "Okay, Mom." His voice sounded normal enough, though Karen's maternal radar picked up something slightly off in his tone. A flatness, maybe, or a carefully maintained control. She filed the observation away, deciding to wait until dinner to investigate further. Sometimes Ethan needed time to process his feelings before he was ready to talk about them. Pushing too hard, too fast, would only make him retreat further. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table that barely fit 2 people. Karen had set out the good plates, the ones that didn't have chips, and had even lit a candle that she'd rescued from a giveaway pile at Mrs. Whitmore's house. Small touches of grace in a life that often felt graceless. Ethan ate mechanically, his eyes fixed on his plate. He'd always been a good eater, attacking his meals with the same focused intensity he brought to his homework. But tonight he seemed to be going through the motions, his mind clearly elsewhere. Karen watched him over her own plate, noting the details. His eyes were slightly red, though he'd clearly tried to disguise it. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there that morning. His hands gripped his fork just a little too tightly, as if he was holding on to control by force of will. Something had happened. Something bad. "How was school today?" Karen asked, keeping her tone light and casual. "Fine," Ethan said automatically. Then, catching himself in the lie, he'd never been good at lying to his mother, he amended. "It was okay." "Just okay?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Mom, I don't really want to talk about it." There it was, confirmation that something had indeed happened. Karen's protective instincts flared immediately, maternal fury rising like a tide. Someone had hurt her child. Someone had made him cry. She was certain of it now, reading the evidence in his puffy eyes and careful control. But she forced herself to remain calm. Ethan was 12, navigating the treacherous waters between childhood and adolescence. He needed space to process his own feelings, to develop emotional resilience. If she reacted too strongly, he might stop telling her things altogether. "Okay, baby," she said gently. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. But you know I'm here when you are, right? Whatever happened, whatever you're feeling, I'm here. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They finished dinner in relative silence, though Karen kept up a gentle stream of conversation about her day, carefully edited to remove the more degrading details, focusing instead on the funny or absurd moments. Mrs. Whitmore's cat knocked over a whole shelf of her porcelain figurines today, Karen said, deliberately injecting humor into her voice. You should have seen her face. She was more worried about the cat being traumatized than about the hundreds of dollars of broken porcelain. Despite himself, Ethan's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. Rich people, Karen continued, encouraged by this small victory. They live in a completely different world, baby. She offered to pay me extra to comfort the cat. I explained that I clean. I don't provide therapy for traumatized pets. This time, Ethan actually laughed, a small, brief sound, but genuine. After dinner, they fell into their evening routine. Ethan cleared the table while Karen washed dishes. They worked in companionable silence, and gradually, Karen could see some of the tension leaving his shoulders. When the kitchen was clean, Karen made them both tea, cheap black tea with a little honey, a small luxury they allowed themselves each evening. They settled on the couch together, and Karen simply held space for her son, not pushing, not prying, just being present. Finally, when the tea was half finished and the silence had stretched long enough to feel safe, Ethan spoke. Mom, do you ever feel like you're fighting against something you can't change? The question caught Karen off guard with its depth and maturity. This wasn't a child asking. This was someone wrestling with fundamental questions about life and justice. Every single day, Karen answered honestly. Fighting against circumstances, fighting against the way the world thinks about people like us, fighting against exhaustion and bills and 1,000 other things. Does it ever feel pointless? Ethan's voice was small. Like maybe you should just accept things the way they are. Karen set down her tea and turned to face her son fully. This was important. She could feel it. Whatever had happened at school today, it had shaken something fundamental in Ethan's sense of self and possibility. Baby, let me tell you something, she said, her voice carrying the weight of every hard lesson she'd learned in 34 years of life. The world is full of people who will tell you to accept your limitations, to stay in your place, to stop reaching for things they don't think you deserve. Most of those people say it because your success threatens their comfortable worldview. If you can rise above your circumstances, it means they can't use circumstances as an excuse for their own failures. She reached out and took Ethan's hand, noting how much bigger it had gotten, how he was growing into someone she could barely recognize from the tiny infant she'd held 12 years ago. When I was 16, Karen continued, I got pregnant with you. My teachers told me to drop out, that there was no point in finishing high school because I'd already ruined my future. My own mother told me I was throwing my life away. Your father, her voice caught slightly, your father said a lot of things before he left, most of them about how I was stupid and lazy and would never make anything of myself. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. He'd heard parts of this story before, but never quite like this. For a long time, Karen said, I believed them. I thought maybe they were right, that I'd made choices that permanently closed off certain possibilities. But then I looked at you, this perfect, beautiful baby, and I realized something. Their words only had power if I gave them power. Their opinions about my worth only mattered if I let them matter. She cupped Ethan's face gently with her free hand, looking directly into his eyes. Someone said something cruel to you today, didn't they? Someone told you that you weren't good enough, or smart enough, or that you'd never succeed. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He nodded. Listen to me very carefully, Ethan Miller, Karen said, her voice fierce now, carrying all the love and conviction she possessed. I don't know who said what, and you can tell me when you're ready. But what I need you to understand right now, really understand, deep in your bones, is that other people's lack of vision doesn't limit your possibilities. Someone else's inability to see your potential doesn't diminish what you actually are. A tear rolled down Ethan's cheek. Karen brushed it away with her thumb. You want to know if the fight is pointless? Karen continued. Only if you let it be. Only if you decide that their words are more powerful than your actions. Every single day that I get up before dawn and clean other people's houses, I'm proving wrong every person who ever said I'd amount to nothing. Every report card you bring home, every book you read, every question you ask, that's you proving them wrong too. But what if they're right? Ethan whispered. What if I am just fooling myself? What if no matter how hard I work, I'll always be, his voice broke, always be just the poor kid who doesn't belong? Then you prove them wrong, Karen said simply, not with words. People who've already made up their minds don't listen to words. You prove them wrong by becoming so undeniably successful that they choke on their own prejudice. She pulled Ethan into a fierce hug, holding him while he cried against her shoulder. This was the cry he'd been holding in since that morning, the one he'd tried to contain in the school bathroom. Now, in the safety of his mother's arms, he could finally release it. I know it hurts, baby, Karen murmured into his hair. I know how much it hurts when someone you're supposed to respect tells you that you're not good enough. But pain can be fuel. Anger can be motivation. Every tear you cry tonight can water the seeds of the person you're going to become. They stayed like that for a long time, mother and son wrapped together on a shabby couch in a tiny apartment, drawing strength from each other the way they always had. When Ethan finally pulled away, his face was red and puffy, but his eyes had a new quality to them, something harder, more determined. Mom, he said, his voice steadier now. I'm going to be a doctor. It wasn't the first time he'd expressed interest in medicine, but there was something different about how he said it now. Not, I want to be a doctor, or maybe I'll be a doctor. This was a statement of absolute intention, a declaration of war against everyone who doubted him. I'm going to be a doctor, Ethan repeated, and I'm going to be so good at it that everyone who ever looked down at us, everyone who ever made you feel small, everyone who ever said I wouldn't amount to anything, they're all going to know they were wrong. Karen felt her own eyes fill with tears, but these were different tears. Tears of pride so fierce it was almost painful. Yes, baby, she said. Yes, you will. And I'm going to be there to watch you do it. 7 years later, Riverside Preparatory Academy graduation. The June sun beat down mercilessly on the rows of white folding chairs set up on Riverside Prep's athletic field. The graduating class of 2019 sat in alphabetical order, their faces a mixture of excitement, relief, and the particular anxiety that comes from wearing polyester robes in 90-degree heat. Ethan Miller sat in the third row, between Angela Martinez and Rachel Morrison. He'd grown in the 7 years since that terrible day in Thompson's classroom. Not just older, but taller, his frame filling out with the awkward but genuine muscle of late adolescence. His face had lost its childish roundness, revealing sharp cheekbones and a jaw that suggested strength. But the most significant changes weren't physical. The boy who had cried in a bathroom stall had been forged into something different through 7 years of relentless dedication. Ethan had become a student who didn't just excel, he dominated. Valedictorian, perfect 4.0 GPA, SAT score of 1580, captain of the academic decathlon team, president of the biology club, volunteer at 3 different community organizations, early acceptance to Stanford University with a full scholarship that would cover not just tuition, but room and board. The transformation hadn't been easy. Every night for 7 years, while his classmates attended parties or relaxed with video games, Ethan had studied. Every weekend, while others hung out at the mall or went to movies, he volunteered at the hospital or attended academic competitions. Every summer, while his wealthy peers traveled to Europe or relaxed at vacation homes, Ethan took advanced courses and worked part-time jobs to help his mother. He'd done it all with the kind of focused intensity that made his teachers shake their heads in amazement and worry. More than once, counselors had called him in to discuss balance and self-care, concerned that he was pushing himself too hard. What they couldn't understand, was that this wasn't about balance. This was about building a life so successful that it would stand as permanent proof against every doubt and sneer and cruel word. Every A+ was armor. Every award was a weapon. Every achievement was another brick in the fortress he was constructing between himself and people like Raymond Thompson. Speaking of Thompson, Ethan's eyes found him in the crowd of faculty members sitting to the side of the stage. 7 years had not been kind to Raymond Thompson. He looked older than his 60 years, his face carrying the particular weariness of someone who had stopped enjoying their work but couldn't afford to retire. His suit was slightly rumpled, his tie crooked. He sat slumped in his chair with the resigned posture of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating an achievement. Their eyes met for just a moment. Ethan held Thompson's gaze steadily and had the satisfaction of watching his former teacher look away first, uncomfortable with whatever he saw in the boy he'd once tried to crush. In the audience, sitting in the section reserved for scholarship families, Karen Miller clutched her program with hands that shook slightly with emotion. She'd taken the day off work, losing a day's pay she couldn't really afford to lose, but nothing could have kept her from this moment. She'd sacrificed everything to get Ethan to this graduation, and now she got to watch him walk across that stage as valedictorian, as someone exceptional, as living proof that determination could overcome circumstance. Principal Dr. Margaret Reynolds approached the podium, her voice carrying across the field through strategically placed speakers. Parents, faculty, honored guests, and most importantly, our graduating class of 2019, she began, launching into the standard graduation speech about journey and growth and stepping into the future. Ethan barely heard it. He'd listened to Dr. Reynolds give variations of this speech at assemblies and awards ceremonies for 7 years. And now, Dr. Reynolds said, her voice warming with genuine pride, "I'd like to introduce our valedictorian, Ethan Miller, who will address his fellow graduates." The applause was respectful, though notably quieter than it would have been for a more popular student. Ethan had earned his classmates' respect through sheer achievement, but he'd never quite earned their affection. He was admired the way you might admire a monument, impressive from a distance but not particularly inviting for close examination. Ethan walked to the podium with careful composure. He'd practiced this speech dozens of times in his room, in front of his bathroom mirror, in the quiet moments before sleep. He knew exactly what he wanted to say, and more importantly, he knew who he was saying it to. He looked out at the crowd, students in their caps and gowns, parents with cameras ready, faculty members in their academic regalia, and began to speak. 7 years ago, Ethan said, his voice clear and steady, I walked through the gates of Riverside Preparatory Academy for the first time. I was a small kid from a poor neighborhood, wearing a second-hand uniform and carrying a backpack my mother had found at a thrift store. I was terrified. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the audience. I was terrified because I knew I didn't belong here. At least, that's what people kept telling me. I didn't have the right clothes, the right background, the right connections. I was a charity case, a scholarship student, someone who had been granted an opportunity as an act of institutional benevolence. In the faculty section, several teachers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual valedictorian speech full of platitudes about friendship and future. There were people who made it very clear that they thought I didn't deserve to be here. Ethan continued, and his eyes flickered briefly to Thompson. People who told me, in words and in actions, that my dreams were unrealistic, that my circumstances would define my destiny, that I would never, he emphasized the word with perfect cutting clarity, amount to anything. A ripple of discomfort moved through the faculty section. Several teachers suddenly found their programs very interesting. So I want to take this moment to address those people directly, Ethan said. I want to thank them. That got everyone's attention. Even the students who had been half paying attention sat up straighter. I want to thank them, Ethan repeated, because their doubt became my fuel. Every time someone looked at me with pity or condescension, every time someone suggested I lower my expectations, every time someone treated me as less than, those moments didn't break me. They forged me. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. The person standing before you today, valedictorian, full scholarship to Stanford University, future doctor, that person exists because someone thought I couldn't become him. That person exists because I chose to prove the doubters wrong rather than prove them right. Karen was crying openly now, pride radiating from her face like heat from summer pavement. But I also want to say something to my fellow students, especially those who came from backgrounds like mine, Ethan continued, his tone softening slightly. You're going to meet people who doubt you. You're going to face teachers, employers, colleagues who will look at your background and make assumptions about your capabilities. They will tell you, explicitly or implicitly, that you should adjust your expectations, that you should accept your limitations, that you should be realistic about your prospects. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. Don't listen to them. Not because their prejudice isn't real. It absolutely is. Not because the obstacles they represent aren't real. They definitely are. Don't listen to them because their lack of vision doesn't limit your possibilities. Someone else's inability to imagine your success has no bearing on your actual potential. He straightened up, his voice taking on a more formal tone as he transitioned into the conclusion of his speech. We stand here today at a crossroads. Some of us will take the paths that have been prepared for us, walking roads that our families have traveled before. Others of us will have to build our own paths through territory that our families have never navigated. Both journeys have value. Both require courage. But to those of you who have to build your own paths, I want to leave you with this thought. The fact that something is difficult doesn't mean it's impossible. The fact that you start from behind doesn't mean you can't finish ahead. The fact that someone doubts you doesn't make their doubt true. He paused, and his voice dropped to something quieter but somehow more powerful. 7 years ago, I was told I would never amount to anything. Today, I stand here as valedictorian. In 8 years, I'll be Dr. Ethan Miller. That transformation didn't happen because I was lucky or exceptional. It happened because I decided that my worth would be determined by my actions, not by someone else's opinions. It happened because I refused to let other people's limitations become my own. He looked directly at Thompson then, holding his gaze. To anyone who was ever told they weren't good enough, prove them wrong. Not for revenge. That's too small a motivation for the work required. Do it for yourself. Do it for everyone who comes after you. Do it to make the world a place where talent and determination matter more than circumstance and privilege. Thank you. The applause that followed was thunderous, genuine, transformative. Students rose to their feet, even those who had never been particularly friendly to Ethan. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. Several faculty members looked deeply uncomfortable, but even they clapped, unable to deny the power of what they'd just witnessed. Only one person in the faculty section remained seated, his face ashen, his hands gripping his chair. Raymond Thompson sat frozen, staring at the young man at the podium who had just systematically dismantled everything Thompson had said to him 7 years earlier. The boy he'd dismissed as a charity case, the student he'd told would never amount to anything, had just delivered the most powerful valedictorian speech in Riverside Prep's 132-year history. And everyone in that audience, knew exactly who Ethan had been talking about when he referenced people who had doubted him. 15 years later, St. Mercy Hospital, Emergency Department, Dr. Ethan Miller moved through the emergency department with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago mastered his craft. At 34, he was one of the youngest attending physicians at St. Mercy, respected by colleagues and beloved by patients for his unusual combination of technical brilliance and genuine compassion. The attending physician's coat he wore wasn't just a uniform. It was armor earned through a decade of relentless work. Stanford Medical School with honors. Residency at Massachusetts General. Fellowships that other doctors competed for. Now, finally, home in his own city, serving the community that had raised him. Dr. Miller, a nurse called out. New patient in exam room 3, 68-year-old male, chest pains, shortness of breath, history of hypertension, no insurance. Ethan picked up the chart, his eyes scanning the vital signs with practiced speed. Then he saw the name, Raymond Thompson. His hand froze. The chart suddenly felt heavy, laden with 15 years of history. "Doctor?" the nurse asked. "Are you okay?" Ethan forced his breathing to steady. "I'm fine. I'll take it." He stood outside exam room 3 for a long moment, gathering himself. Through the small window, he could see an old man on the examination table, thin, gray, diminished. Thompson looked nothing like the imposing figure who had once wielded absolute authority over a classroom. Time and illness had stripped away that power, leaving only a frightened elderly man struggling to breathe. Ethan pushed open the door. Thompson's eyes widened with recognition immediately. "Ethan," he whispered, the name carrying equal parts surprise and shame. "Mr. Thompson." Ethan kept his voice professional, neutral. "I'm Dr. Miller. I'll be treating you today." He moved through the examination with clinical precision, listening to Thompson's heart, checking his breathing, asking the necessary questions. Thompson answered in monosyllables, his eyes never quite meeting Ethan's. "Your symptoms suggest unstable angina," Ethan said finally. "We need to admit you for observation and run more tests. Given your lack of insurance, I'll work with our financial services to—" "Why are you helping me?" Thompson interrupted, his voice breaking. "After what I said to you. After what I did." Ethan set down his stethoscope. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, and Thompson saw the boy he'd humiliated staring back at him through the man's eyes. "You told me I'd never amount to anything," Ethan said quietly. "You tried to crush a 12-year-old's dreams because you'd given up on your own. You used your position to hurt someone who couldn't fight back." Thompson's eyes filled with tears. "I know. God help me, I know. I've thought about you almost every day since your graduation speech. I've lived with what I did, and now you're my patient." Ethan interrupted. "And that means I'm going to give you the best care I'm capable of providing, not because you deserve it, not because I've forgotten what you did, but because I decided a long time ago what kind of person I wanted to be." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You were wrong about me, Mr. Thompson. But more importantly, you were wrong about what determines a person's worth. It's not their circumstances. It's not their background. It's the choices they make when they have power over someone else." Ethan opened the door. "A cardiologist will be in to see you shortly. You're in good hands." As he walked away, Ethan felt something release in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying for 15 years finally lifting. Thompson's words hadn't defined him. They'd challenged him. Yes, hurt him, absolutely. But Ethan had chosen his response, had built his life into a refutation of everything Thompson believed. That evening, Ethan sat in his small office finishing paperwork. His phone rang, his mother's number. "Hey, Mom. Baby, how was your day?" Ethan smiled, thinking about the frightened old man in the cardiac unit who would receive the same excellent care as every other patient, regardless of their past or Ethan's personal feelings. "It was a good day, Mom, a really good day." "I'm proud of you, Ethan. Every single day I'm proud of you." "I know, Mom, I know." And he did. That was the thing about proving people wrong. The sweetest victory wasn't their recognition of your success. It was becoming someone you could be proud of, regardless of whether they ever admitted their mistake. Raymond Thompson would recover. He'd be discharged with a treatment plan and a second chance at life. Whether he learned anything from it was his choice. Ethan had already made his.